and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Today we'll be discussing cybercrime and cybersecurity in the region. October is usually recognized as Cybersecurity Month, so we decided to get a head start. For regular readers of ICT Pulse, and every year for the past few years, we have had an Expert Insight series on cybersecurity in the Caribbean, in which we pose a series of questions to network security professionals based in the region. Today on this episode, we'll be interviewing one of these experts. Garfield Gordon is a senior systems engineer at Cisco. Although he was initially based in Jamaica when he participated in our Expert Insight series, he now works out of Cisco's Miami-Fort Lauderdale office, which covers the Caribbean. Garfield has over 25 years' experience in the ICT space. His area of expertise include systems integration, networking, internet security, wireless, mobile, applications development, and business enablement. Garfield, that is a mouthful, but welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Yeah, I know. I've been around the space for a very long time.
And we're going to touch on that a bit later, but let's just jump right in with just talking about the types of incidents and threats that one sees in the region. Can you give us a sense as to what those might be?
Well, over the past few years, we've been getting the same type of attacks occurring globally. So we've been targeted with ransomware. We have attacks that are targeted to certain organizations, specifically the financial services entities. And, they've gotten, with the release of some of the tools in the dark web, they now have better tools to circumvent some of the defense and mitigation factors that we have in place. And also, we see a lot of incidents of malware. But when we do the analysis, we recognize that it's not coming through the internet from the perimeter firewalls, but rather someone is bringing it into the organization from their laptops.
Okay.
Yeah, they'll be working on something at home, or their kids are using it, or they'll visit a hotel, they got infected, now they brought it into the organization.
What you're seeing now, how is that different from what you might have been seeing 5 years ago, 7 years ago? Any trends you're seeing?
Well, no, it's more, the attacks are more focused around the applications and not so much the infrastructure. 5 to 7 years ago, we had to bolster the infrastructure. So we had to harden our firewalls. We had IDS systems in place and so on. But today, it's more attacking an application. So we know a particular website, if it's running, say, Java struts, there might be a vulnerability. So we attack the framework. Sorry, let me not say we. The attackers will target the framework, find a vulnerability, and then start to exfiltrate data. Similarly, the use of malware will do the same thing, where depending on the malware, it might be something like creating a botnet that will then provide a denial of service attack. So that's the shift in the mechanics from 5+ years ago to today. It's moving away from infrastructure now to applications.
And I guess for the layman, what would sort of be the implication of that?
So it's really about sourcing data, getting personable, identifiable information of a person. So that would be name and address, credit card information, unique identifiers such like a driver's license number, or in the case of Jamaica, a TRN number, and then using this data set in order to promote identity theft or scamming or any one of the various higher level crime facilities that we're exposed to today.
And you had mentioned that, like, for malware coming in through, for example, employees in terms of devices that they're bringing into the office and connecting to the office network. And that is how some of the infections and incidents are triggered. But have you seen, for example, that are there any sort of practices or behavior that you're seeing in organizations, especially in the Caribbean, that, might have been okay 5-7 years ago, but now it's really causing organizations to be vulnerable and open to threats?
Yes and no. I mean, because of the shift from infrastructure to applications, most business entities have never spent the investment in protecting or designing their applications in a secure fashion. And so, to cite an example, the hack on Equifax that occurred last year, a report was released recently that detailed the method of attack. And what we found is that although the company had procedures and policies in place to do random checks, repetitive checks, to do the updates and all the things that we stress in cybersecurity, there were some elements within the organization that were missed. And so, the failure of one component, they did not update one component for 10 months. And so that created a cascading effect whereby the attackers were able to identify a system that was not patched. Then the element that was not updated for 10 months, it was unable now to identify that a particular vulnerability was available on that system. The attackers went in, they did their reconnaissance attack, they got some information, and then a few days later, they went back with a more direct attack to exfiltrate data, to get data out of the platform. And so it's these types of events that we're now looking at. So it's not so much the infrastructure element, which is an important element, but it's now looking at it from an application perspective. Because let's take a firewall. Once we're hosting a web server internally, we will open that port to allow access to the web server, typically port 80 or port 443. And attackers know this. So now, rather than bombarding a firewall with all the possible paths to get into the network, you just attack port 80. It's open. So now my focus is not about getting into the organization. It's being able to exploit a vulnerability on the web server. In terms of some of the practices from yesteryear to today, we're now looking at digital transformation. So let's say like a manufacturing or utility facility, public utilities, like a power company or water company. Today, they're putting in more IoT devices like smart meters, electronic switching elements, or sensors to ensure that an environment has the correct amount of humidity, or there's no water in a floor, or the temperature is at an ideal temperature. And all of these things or these solutions go towards creating efficiencies within that environment. So with that, IoT devices come with an inherent vulnerability, so to speak, because the device will normally have a fixed username and password or credentials to gain access to that device. And most devices, we cannot change that information. And so an attacker who is aware of the type of sensors that you're using in your environment can create a targeted attack to get information out of the system, or sometimes to create what we call a zombie. So they will take over the controls and the functionality of that particular device or sensor, and then use that as a launching pad to launch another type of attack.
Wow. So, I mean, there is a big thrust across the region and to varying degrees in terms of countries wanting to move towards smart cities. And as you said, I guess utility companies have been taking out in front in terms of installing smart meters. And I'm sure that to varying degrees, they have tried to put sensors across their networks and their infrastructure. Yes. But how could they begin to manage a situation like that, where this inherent vulnerability that you're talking about? Because you feel as if you want to take a step backwards, and we shouldn't be moving towards all of this digital transformation and becoming, and our environment becoming smarter.
Yes. So the good thing is that we have frameworks and models in place. One of them notably being the Purdue model that provides a framework or a layout of how these different sensors should be connected into the network, what portions should be secured by different elements, and how data should move from one location to another. So segmentation. So these are all laid out in the frameworks. And once we apply those frameworks, then we could have a secure environment. And then on top of that, by utilizing services like penetration testing, we're able now to validate that that model is secure, or that implementation of that model is secure.
Okay. At least there seems to be some hope. And talk us through a bit more about penetration testing. I get the sense that it should be done on a regular basis. And I guess what has been your experience in terms of the extent to which organizations conduct regular penetration testing exercises?
So it varies. I mean, typically regulated environments like banks or any entity that has a governance and compliance framework, they will do penetration testing more frequently. And penetration testing is just a method of having, it could be an internal staff member or external entity, which is usually the case, perform a targeted attack against your infrastructure. And then it will highlight what areas or where there are areas of compromise, and they will provide a recommendation as to how to remediate this vulnerability. And in that, sometimes it's also the documentation portion where we'll say, please modify your compliance policy to look at a particular vulnerability and what that remediation should be. So sometimes it's down to like a HR policy in that, you know, if an employee pulls payroll information from an internal server, that's considered a security vulnerability. And so the action would be termination of that employee.
Oh.
Right. So different policies and different compliance mechanisms.
So let me ask this question. And I mean, granted that since you work for an equipment supplier, granted your answer might be a bit biased. But what do you think in terms of the spend of organizations on security? Because here it is, we're talking about penetration testing, and yes, the banks might be one of the sort of groups that may have measures in place to ensure that it's conducted on a regular basis. But what about other organizations, and especially like SMEs and so on? What has been your sort of observations and experience?
So, I mean, we've been engaged. So the service providers across the region, being Digicel,
Flow,
Cable and Flow. I was a bit confused as to which name to use. But yeah, Flow/Cable and Wireless, and also other entities like Cloud Caribbean in the Bahamas. We have been working with them around what we call their managed services offer. And in those offers, they're looking at providing services to the SME market, like penetration testing and security management and consultation. So these are areas that, you know, not just Cisco, but I know for a fact that some of our competitors within the region are also working with them in order to do these types of services. From a sales perspective, normally we would categorize different groups and we would call them, you know, small business, medium business, large enterprise, service provider. And the offers to these different groups would be different. So typically a small, like let's say an auto parts store, we would consider them to be a small entity. They would typically have only one network switch. We put a very small firewall in place in order to get out to the internet. Sometimes they will use a unified threat management device, an all-in-one device, so it has wireless and routing and everything all in one. And that would be positioned at the SME environment. And so typically we would look at the levels of concern for that type of customer. They're using a point of sale platform, which is now, from our perspective, an application. We have nothing to do with it. Can we provide a layer of protection? Yes, with a minimal footprint. And so for those type of entities, we would say to the service providers or the managed service providers, can you provide like a security operations center or a network operations center in order to provide visibility for these types of customers? Then when we move to, let's say, the large enterprise, let's say like the banks, they would normally want to manage their own environment, having their own sensors, etc. And so we have a different type of positioning and a different type of equipment set that will go to that environment. Then we have the exceptions. So I'll ask you a question. An organization with 20 users, what category would you place that organization in? Small, medium, large?
I guess within the Caribbean context, they might be considered medium.
Well, this is true. All right. So small and medium. Now, if that entity is doing transactions amounting to $40 billion US annually,
yes,
would you still consider them small, or would you move them up?
You'd have to move them up. I guess, is it really about the users, or is it about
the transactions.
Yeah, the sensitivity of the work that they're doing.
Exactly. So we have those exceptional items across the region, or those entities that are exceptional across the region. And so we have to look at their business. So it's not just about the size of the entity now, but it's what they're doing. And so with that in mind, we sometimes have to position, let's say a $500,000 solution in order to provide protection for them. And, when you look at an entity like that, depending on their business, it might be where their penalties would be $100,000 per end client per hour for downtime.
Mm-hmm.
So they may, in fact, be losing tens of millions of dollars per hour. So for them, making the investment of $500,000 is a no-brainer.
Yes.
Right. So it's not just about looking at the size of the organization and what they are, what category they fall into. It's also looking at their business and the penalties and their policy and compliance and all these other factors that, we really don't like getting into because it's just too much reading.
I understand.
There is a solution for almost any category of business, whether it's a managed service offered by a service provider, or looking at someone managing their own on-premise account, or by using the cloud to manage multiple entities, because there are organizations that are regional organizations or multinationals that need the ability to manage an entity in St. Lucia, in St. Kitts, in Jamaica, in Trinidad, in the Cayman Islands. And so the easiest platform in order to manage this would be a cloud platform. So there's some amount of education that we also have to provide to our end customer base to say that not everything in the cloud is bad. Because there are just some persons that once they hear the word cloud, they don't care whether it's a private cloud, hybrid cloud, public cloud. They just hear cloud and it says they're anti-cloud. Nope, I don't want it, don't care about it. But for them, in order to manage multiple tiers, it's more expensive because now they have to purchase higher speed links going to the different islands. Typically we're talking tens of thousands of dollars per month. And so the operational expense is very high compared to using a cloud service where the operational expense would be much lower.
Understood.
At the end of the day, we move away from the technology per se and the features to more looking at the business and what's your risk appetite, what are the penalties associated to the risk, what can you afford to lose, right? Because there are things that we don't even think about in an organization. Something like a multifunction printer, like your Xerox photocopier.
Mm-hmm.
You just use it every day. But there's a lot of data that's being stored on that printer because every time when we do a scan, it's actually saving that information to a hard drive in the device, in the machine. Okay. And, a savvy attacker could say, hey, you know what? It's they're now looking at their business model. They're looking at their initiatives for next year, their strategies. This is the time that I should go and attack them.
Yes.
And this is more from a corporate espionage perspective.
Yeah, because as you're saying that and talking about the machine, and in some organizations, so for example, sadly, I have to mention it, like in the banks, you go in and you're doing some sort of transaction and they make a photocopy of your ID.
Yes.
Right? So that information would be stored on the copier.
Correct.
So talk about getting personal information. You don't necessarily have to go and hack into some, secured server. Yeah.
That is correct. And so it's that's why we take a holistic approach to security. So today, when we talk about cybersecurity, it's really encompassing physical security, right? Because that's the first point of access. How can I physically access the servers, right? And then we talk about things like monitoring with video surveillance and so on. Then there is an infrastructure security. How can I protect the network? It could be something as simple as swapping out my copper cables to fiber cables. Because with copper cables, I can use a device and actually take all the signals that are passing along the copper cable and copying it to my laptop.
Yes.
So I can go home and just replay everything that occurred for the entire day and looking for certain patterns or transactions. So sometimes it's as simple as changing out the fiber cable. Then we look at the application security. So, as outlined earlier, many of the attacks that occurred in the past 2 years have been predominantly application related. So this is by looking at a vulnerability in the operating system or looking at a vulnerability in the application layer itself. So something like Java. And so if these systems are not patched, then we have the ability to get data from a database. I know, lots of things to think about.
I am reeling as you talk. I'm still just processing it all. So probably while I process it, let me let you talk some more. But what we're going to talk about is you. So I just want to just pivot a little bit since to talk about, your background. You've been working at Cisco for a while, but how did you become involved in network security?
Well, we have to go back a bit in time,
How far back?
Well, back to the point when I was, let's say, in high school.
Okay.
I'll start from there. Electronics was my hobby. Electronics and then computing. I attended St. Catherine High School. And thankfully, we had the opportunity to have a computer lab that was outfitted with Apple IIe computers. And of course, like any other youngster, I started off by playing games. But I was intrigued by this system and I wanted to learn more. And the computer science teacher at the time, he was also, really loving computing and wanting to learn more. And, we created our computer group and we started looking at the systems. And then thankfully, my mom saw that I was interested in computing and she herself had done a course in using the IBM punch cards, which I didn't know. So she knew what the direction of the world was going in terms of computers and electronic data processing and so on. So she was happy that naturally I found, my joy in using electronics and computers. So she supported that dream. And, along with my friends, we started playing with Ataris and Tandy. And then I got my first modem. And I was connecting to a local bulletin board service in Jamaica. This was all prior to having the internet. So, we connected, we were sending messages. It's like what we do on WhatsApp today. But this was being done with your computer. And then I enrolled in UTech. It was CAST at the time, College of Arts, Science and Technology, now University of Technology. And, whilst there, I had some challenges with some of my lecturers because I knew some stuff and it was clear that they didn't know it, but that's some challenge.
Okay.
But thankfully we were able to come to an accord, and there were methods that I would use that when I pointed it out to my lecturer, he would say, "Oh, okay, I see what you're doing now," and he would make the appropriate correction. So my grade thankfully moved from a C to an A. But it's just the art of computing in that there are different ways of doing the thing. Like baking a cake.
Yes.
We might have a recipe, but there are different ways in which we can apply, the quantities or the elements to baking that cake.
Yes.
And so at UTech, this was at the time when we were connecting the universities, both UTech and UWI, to the internet. And I worked with a great mentor called, his name is Archie Marshall, and he guided me through setting up the system at UTech and being able to connect to the internet and pull down our electronic mailbox. And then so it was distributed now to all the lecturers and the students that had the privilege of using the internet. And I learned a lot there. And then I moved on working with the Bank of Jamaica, learning about the System 38. And at the time, they were transitioning to AS400. So I learned about the different platforms, learned about PC systems, moved on to another job where I was doing what at the time we would call working on exotic systems, because these were things like there's only one or two units in the entire country.
Yes.
So, like SGI, Unix, and Citrix. And a few years later, I migrated to Canada, where because of this prior experience working with multiple systems, it was very easy for me to get a job. And I started off in the networking department, but then because of my skill sets, they moved me, I got promoted to managing the internet data center for the organization that I worked at. And they also had a subsidiary, or well, another division that worked with government services. So now this is where security started to play an important role for me, because prior to that, I did do simple things like firewalls. Back a few years prior to that, I worked with the checkpoint firewalls and then the Cisco firewalls. But now working at this company in Canada, we had to do policy and compliance to policy. And that was now when it really started to let me understand how many factors really go into security.
Yes.
Yeah. So I wouldn't even just call it network security. So, at the same time, we're doing for one of the government entities that we worked for, one of their requirements was that once a user has been entered into the system, all transactions pertaining to that user must be represented as Jane Doe or John Doe. So no longer could we have the real name of the user. However, at the end of the calendar year, we needed to print their T4s, so their tax information, which had to contain their real name.
Yes.
So, it was the first time that I was working on a project now where we had to actually separate data. So when the user was created, we would have their real name upon creation, but then it would be changed in the system as being Jane or John Doe and a number. And then for the year-end processing, we would have to use that table now, bring it back in, and then convert John and Jane Doe to their real name. Mm-hmm. And so there are also other security implications around maintaining this translation table, in that, we had to have a vice president or senior executive, and there would be like a primary and backup type situation. And in that backup could not reside in the province. They had to reside on the other side of the country and things like that. So It was just really, really intense. And a few years later, I was now affected by one of those policies, in that there was a security audit. And in that audit, they were assessing all the persons who were responsible for different systems and who could touch, what were the touch points for the different systems, etc. So coming from Jamaica, being a jack of all trades, master of none, that was great for me. I learned everything. But now, being in an environment that was siloed, it was a problem. Mm-hmm. Because I was either primary or backup for almost every system that was there.
Right.
And so the risk item was that I could perform a financial transaction and erase my tracks. Mm-hmm. So I was now flagged as a security risk.
Oh, well.
So, I learned a lot. And like I said, my experience throughout my career helped me. And even, for that experience when I was flagged, I wasn't upset. I actually understood why. Mm-hmm. And the company treated me well. I got a nice exit package. Came back as a consultant, still did some stuff with them, because now I was helping them to fix all of these different issues.
Right.
But now, in terms of like the settings and the parameters, I would just tell someone what to do, but I wouldn't be the one doing it, which was great. I also didn't have to write reports, which was even better. And then I came back to Jamaica, or went back to Jamaica, and I started. I was working for Digicel, and then several months in, I got contacted by someone at Cisco.
Okay.
Actually, through the team, I was working. Cisco was our suppliers, and they, in the meetings that we've had and so on, they were surprised at my knowledge and they made a recommendation. Someone contacted me, and shortly after, I was working with Cisco.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so looking at all your experience and even just the path that you've taken to get where you've gotten, if a similar teenager came and said, Mr. Gordon, how could I become, a security expert? What would you advise them?
Well, honestly, I've been in that position. It's a challenging question to answer. Let me explain it like this. Most people come to me and they'll ask, what course should I take or what degree should I possess? Mm-hmm. But when you look at the typical attacker, they don't have a degree. What they've done is to spend their time learning different systems, learning different applications, different operating systems, different network policies, and they're an attacker. compared to someone who went to school, did a degree, learned something that they've never used and most times will never use, and they still just understand the basics. So, how do you compare? It's really around interest and thought process, because now you have to think like an attacker and you have to have the interest to learn all these different systems and platforms and operating system. For me, it was easy because I had that interest and I went out and I learned a lot. And thankfully, at the time when I started to learn all of these different programming languages and systems and methods, it was simple, because when I started my career, we weren't using Windows as much. Only like 5 people I knew who had Windows version 2 and then Windows version 3, and then it kept on growing and moving. So for me, it was easy to come up into the transition as opposed to someone who wants to learn it today. Because today you have to learn Windows, Linux, Mac, ZOS, microcode, embedded systems. You have to learn all these different things. So it's a degree or learning the knowledge is good. And the truth is, if you take a look at many of the recent job postings in North America and Europe for cybersecurity experts, they're not even asking for a degree. It says a degree preferred, but equivalent experience and hands-on is what we're looking for. So it really comes down to the environment.
And that is so true, because clearly, as you rightfully said, a lot of the hackers and those who are orchestrating a lot of these, the threats and developing the crimes and committing the breaches don't really have a degree. And the degree itself I think sometimes it can limit or blinker how you process things. And certainly, as you rightfully said, you probably have to have a greater interest than just what would be sustained through academic study.
Correct.
All right, so let's begin to wind this down now. And although you've mentioned so many things, but I just want us to probably begin to summarize some of the thoughts and discussions that we've had so far. And one of the questions, at least that our listeners, especially those who are in businesses or in organizations, might be interested in, is if you could just tell us again what new and emerging threats that we should be more aware of.
Again, there is still a lot of malware out there. For a lot of the web applications, there's still what we call SQL injection attacks that are being performed. And this is because the person who developed the application, they did not put any sort of controls in place to validate the request. So sometimes in a SQL injection attack, what I will do, or what the attacker would do, is to craft actual SQL query command that is placed in as, let's say, as the username. And if there is no validation of that username field, what happens is that entire string will be forwarded to the database. The database will process it and send back the results. And so I will get all the information for that particular query that was submitted. So there needs to be a lot of focus around the web applications that are being developed. And there are many companies out there, many consulting firms that can help in doing this. Cisco is one of them. My friends, Checkpoint and Fortinet, they are another. And believe it or not, the top 5 accounting firms or consulting firms, KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, or their new name now, and Accenture, they have teams that are dedicated to this type of process. So assistance is available.
Excellent. And finally, what might be 3 key things you would advise organizations to do to improve their network security?
Well, the good thing is that today, all the big players are using artificial intelligence and machine learning and fuzzy logic. And these tools are now helping to be able to identify the ransomware attacks. They're able to identify many types of malware. And they use what we call behavioral analytics in order to identify or determine by providing a level of indication of compromise. They provide a score to say, do I believe that this type of activity is behaving like a malware? And as the score increases, it can automatically block that type of traffic from passing over the network until somebody goes and acknowledges it. So there are tools that are built in now, and with all the advancements around technology, again, being in the AI ML space, we don't have to worry as much. But as I highlighted before, one of the main areas to look at today is application security. So we need to look at that Java platform that's being used. Does it have any vulnerabilities? We need to look at that IIS platform, that PHP platform, because these are all the very first entry road into, our tool or our product that we're offering to the public. The other area that we don't look at is around the payment systems. And there are policies in place like the PCI DSS standard that dictates how these different systems should be placed within an organization. Thankfully, some of these elements can be handed off to somebody else. So if you look at many sites that you visit today, you will see we'll accept PayPal payments, or this site is protected by Visa, or this site is protected by MasterCard. So these other entities, these third parties are saying, you don't have to worry about the infrastructure and data security. You just need to be able to follow our guidelines in how to send data to us, and we will process it on your behalf. So, there's certain areas of application security that we need to place focus on, and in other areas, we can hand off to a third party. Another area, and this was highlighted also in the Equifax breach, is we need to look at microsegmentation. One of the reasons why the attackers were able to get so much information, 145 million accounts, was that all the databases were in the same VLAN. They were in the same zone. So once they got onto one database internally and they had the ability to work on that one server, they now had the capability of branching out to every other database server that was in that VLAN, in that locality. And so that was how they were able now to siphon out so much data. Had it been segmented in different VLANs, so database 1 would be in, let's say, VLAN 1, database 2 in VLAN 2, and so on, then they would not have been able to get access to so much data. They would only be able to focus on this one database that they had access to. So microsegmentation is another area that we need to look at. And the third item, which I know every IT person hates, is policy, documentation, and compliance information. You knew it was coming, right, Michelle?
I knew. Yes. I definitely have heard the lament.
Yeah. Honestly, for me, having been through different entities, because I did some work with an affiliate to CIBC in Canada, and when I got the policy document, it was like reading a college level textbook. There was a few hundred pages of policies, but they had a policy for every single item. And, doing things like a disaster recovery or business continuity planning, it was also something that I hated because, I thought that by providing my methods of how I did work or what exactly I did on a system would be diminishing my value. Mm-hmm. But in reality, it's also helping the business to recover.
Yes.
So, when you're doing a disaster recovery or BCP test, the best way to prove that your policy is correct is by handing it to the weakest technology-oriented employee that you have. And if they can follow the booklet and bring back the system online, your policy is good. No additional work is needed.
And that is so true. So many of us who work in the technical field and technology, you feel as if you don't need to write or you don't need to document. And that is not the case. But increasingly, I think we are being pushed to the point where we now need to ensure that we are documenting everything. Because as you rightfully say, what it helps to demonstrate our value, as much as we sometimes think it diminishes it, it demonstrates our value. And it facilitates a certain amount of transparency and accountability as well, and rigor into the processes and the systems that we say that we have implemented and implemented well.
Yep. But like what I learned earlier on in my life, even although I may know how to do everything, depending on where I'm working, I may not display that I know everything. I don't want to be a security risk again.
Understood. This was so good, Garfield, and thank you so much. I'm actually looking forward to listening to this again and making some more notes. And I'm sure, some of the security personnel and specialists that probably will be listening to the podcast will gain a lot of insights from this. And as much as it is not usually, this interview is not usually is not in our March, April timeframe when we usually do our expert insights, I certainly will be calling it an expert insight for cybersecurity because you have just shared such tremendous information and advice.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Rochelle. I appreciate that.
And, don't be a stranger. I think the last expert insight you did with us was probably 2013. So, we are so overdue for this catch up with you.
I try, but, I manage 28 countries and everybody wants something now. So I no longer have any free time.
I understand. So thanks again.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And, to everybody listening to the podcast, I appreciate you listening. And, please put your comments on the site and I'll respond if necessary. Again, best of luck to everyone.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.